Are you running on empty? Do you feel as if there's nothing left? Just think about the last year and a half we've been through: pandemic, isolation, fear, uncertainty and difficulty. Are you running on empty? What about your health? Have you had health struggles that have left you feeling drained and unable to take any more? Maybe you've been supporting loved ones as they deal with illness and pain, and right now you've nothing left and you're running on empty. Maybe you've had financial problems. Maybe you've had reduced hours. You've been furloughed. You've been made unemployed. Or maybe on the other side, and you're doing all you can to keep your business going, to keep your employees in work. And after all this, do you feel like you're running on empty? What about socially? After a year and a half of isolation without normal interaction, how do you feel when you haven't had those coffee mornings, you haven't had those days out, you haven't had the family get-togethers, you haven't had the birthday parties or celebrations, you haven't had the hugs? Emotionally, are you running on empty? What about spiritually? With all of these challenges, with all the doubts, without the chance to worship together, without the support of your prayer group or your church, are you running on empty? Do you feel right now as if you've held it together for this long, you've kept going, but you've got nothing left to give? You're running on empty. And yet the demands keep coming. Demands on our time, demands on our skills, demands on our finances. And if you're running on empty, how much more can you take? If you're running on empty, how can you take any more right now? If you feel like you're running on empty, then this video is for you. Today, we're going to have a look at a story about someone who was running on empty. Someone who literally had nothing left. And who, at their lowest, at their most vulnerable, was asked to give more, was asked to give everything. So if you feel like you're running on empty, join me today as we look at this short story from the life of Elijah. Elijah was a prophet of God, and he's most famous for his conflict with King Ahab, and particularly Ahab's wife Jezebel. And in this part of the story, he has prophesied that there's going to be a drought. The drought kicks in, but miraculously he's provided for, where God leads into a small stream where birds bring him food, but after a while the stream dries up. And so after the stream dries up, God sends him to a little village called Zarephath in Sidon. Now Sidon, of course, is where Jezebel comes from, so it's not looking good for Elijah. But it's here where Elijah meets someone who's running on empty. When Elijah came near the town gate of Zarephath, he saw a widow gathering sticks for a fire. "Would you please bring me a cup of water?" he asked. As she left to get it, he asked her, "Would you please also bring me a piece of bread?" The widow answered, "In the name of the living Lord your God, I swear I don't have any bread. All I have is a handful of flour and a little olive oil. And I'm on my way home now with these few sticks to cook what I have for my son and me. After that, we will starve to death." The widow is running on empty. She's running on empty. She has nothing left. As a widow, she's already in a precarious situation even before the drought. She doesn't have anyone to support her. She probably isn't working or have a source of income. She's reliant on other people's charity. And all that goes with the drought. Her desperation is made so clear in the Hebrew, where it literally says, "I will go. I will prepare it. We will eat it. then we die. I don't know what you would choose for your last meal, but I would like more than a piece of plain bread. There's a lesson here for us to learn. Sometimes a little is a lot. When you're running on empty, small things can push you over the edge. A piece of bread, some other translations call it a morsel. That's all he asked for. Yet he's literally asking for her last meal. A lot of people are running on empty right now. So remember, in your dealings with other people, remember what seems like a little to you may be a lot to someone else. As always, but especially now, treat others with kindness, because you never know when they're running on empty, and you never know what little may push them over the edge. There's something else here about running on empty and that life we live. Running on empty doesn't necessarily mean you've lost your faith. The widow, she has nothing left. She is going to have her last meal. She's facing death, yet she still refers to the living Lord. True, there's some distance. She says, "You're God," but still she acknowledges the existence of God. Just because you're running on empty doesn't make you a bad person. Just because you feel distant from God doesn't make you an unbeliever. It's okay to ask why. It's okay to wonder where God is. It's okay to have doubts. And running on empty brings all these to the fore. It's normal. It's natural. And it doesn't mean you've lost your faith. And that brings us to a really intriguing question. Why? Why when she's nothing left? Why when she's about to have her last meal? Why when she's facing death does she offer him a drink? She has nothing. She's looking for sticks to cook her last meal, and yet she stops to offer a stranger some hospitality. Why? Have you ever wondered why the disciples on the road to Emmaus welcomed Jesus in? I mean, they hadn't recognised him as Jesus yet. They'd had a long journey. Why did they welcome him in? Why did she give food and water to Elijah? Hospitality was a spiritual practice. Hospitality was something they had to do. Hospitality was almost habitual. And that tells us something really important. It tells us that spiritual practices are important. Why? Well, spiritual practices put us in a place where we can meet God. It puts us in a place where we can experience God's grace. If the widow hadn't done it, this story wouldn't have happened. If the disciples had ignored it, they wouldn't have recognized Jesus when he broke the bread. And that gives us a really important lesson for today. And that's this: spiritual practices are important even when we don't feel like doing them, because they put us in a place where we can meet God. So, if you feel like you're running on empty and you don't feel like praying, do it anyway. If you feel like you're running on empty and you don't feel like worshipping, do it anyway. If you don't feel like going to church because you're running empty, and if you can't do it physically, you can do it virtually, but do it anyway. If you don't feel like singing, do it anyway. Even if you don't feel like doing it, do it. Because it puts you in a place where God can meet you and you may experience his grace. Elijah said, "Everything will be fine. Do what you said. Go home and fix something for you and your son. But first, please make me a small piece of bread and bring it to me. The Lord God of Israel has promised that your jar of flour won't run out and your bottle of oil won't dry up before he sends rain for the crops." Now, as we read and interpret this story, we need to be careful. This isn't some kind of prosperity gospel with God promising wealth in all circumstances. This isn't some kind of do your best and God will do the rest. I tell you, Martin Luther would have been really angry at that. He would have jumped up, and the idea of us being able to do anything would just got him so enraged and angry. No. This is not even a promise that God will provide. It's not about God simply blessing us. This story, we need to understand that. This story is about blessing others when you're running on empty. This story is about responding generously. This is a story about responding to God's call. This is a story about responding to God's call to service, to hospitality, to help. This is a story about responding to God's call when you've nothing left to give, yet you do. This is a story about laying down everything you have for the benefit of others. This story tells us that if we respond with generosity to God's call, then the God who is generous will work through us. The widow went home and did exactly what Elijah had told her. She and Elijah and her family had enough food for a long time. The Lord kept the promise that his prophet Elijah had made, and she did not run out of flour or oil. The widow responds with faithful obedience. The widow does what she is asked to do, and God uses her to bless Elijah. God keeps his word. The living God provides life. That one meal provides for Elijah and her family throughout the period of the drought. That one small jar of flour and one small jar of oil brings life and sustenance and blessing. The story tells us that there's 3 years of drought. We don't know how long Elijah was at the brook, maybe half a year, even maybe a year, which means that little jar, that little bag of flour, that little meal of bread lasted between 2 and 2.5 years. That meal fed them. The Lord, the living Lord, provides life and bread that brings life. God takes what's empty and turns it into a generous blessing. God takes her from someone who is running on empty to a sustainer of a prophet. She is blessed in order to be a blessing. Her survival, her security came not from feeding herself, but from serving others. As we said before, this is not a story of providence, safekeeping. It's a call instead not to be frightened or limited by our empty tanks. It's a call not to give up hope. It's a call to practice radical spiritual practices, even when we don't feel like it. It's a call to respond to God with a yes. We may feel like we're running on empty. We may feel as if we've nothing left to give. We may feel as if a little something will push us over the edge. But if God calls us, if God calls on us to give of our time, our talents, or our treasure, it comes with a promise. It comes with a promise that our empty tanks will become a source of blessing to those in need. So I'll ask you again, are you running on empty? Do you feel as if you've nothing left to give? Because the widow of Zarephath, she tells you that when you feel at your most helpless, God can use you to help others. She tells you today that in your emptiness, you can be a blessing to others. God does not necessarily promise comfort. But this story tells us that if he asks us to give of what little we have, it will not run out. If He has called us to serve, to give, to help, then He will provide. He will ensure that we're able to do it. He will work through us. He will turn our empty tanks into reservoirs of generosity. So today, if you are running on empty, take courage. It's normal in this life, and especially after the struggles we've all seen recently. But keep your faith. Keep putting yourself where you can meet God. Keep putting yourself where you will experience His grace. And trust Him. Trust Him when He calls you to live lives of service, help, hospitality, and generosity. Allow God to use your emptiness to bless others. Are you running on empty? Then say yes to God. May the living God bring life to you today. May the gracious God who gave His life for us fill you with His grace. May the Spirit of God turn your emptiness into blessing for others. Amen.